there has been a rise of antisemitism in Europe, in the world more broadly. You wrote in the piece for us that anti-Semitism is a threat to the very fabric of our civilization, and now subscribe wholeheartedly to that assessment. But if you could tell us what you think is happening that leads to this resurgence of anti-Semitism at this point in time.
There are, if we really want to focus on anti-Semitism, three major sources. There is, of course, the so-called old-fashioned right-wing anti-Semitism that we are mostly familiar with and which we all recognize. But to tell you honestly, this is not what I'm mostly concerned about. And the reason is that particularly when we talk about Western Europe, this is not where the major threat comes from, certainly not in terms of violence. And this is also where at least the Jewish communities can be assured of real solidarity from the rest of society. It gets more tricky when anti-Semitism comes from the Muslim community. And as a matter of fact, over the last 6 years, 15 Jews have been murdered in anti-Semitic attacks, all by radical Muslims. And here it is much more difficult to talk about it for a variety of reasons: political correctness, a understandable sensitivity not to try to stigmatize an entire community and not to fuel anti-Muslim sentiments separately, but nevertheless we need to confront the reality that unfortunately, particularly Arab but Muslim societies in general, are rife with anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism has been nurtured really over decades, and that many of immigrants and also second, third generations carry with them that kind of cultural baggage, and that we need to confront. And the other part of the anti-Semitic problem that really ails, particularly when we focus on West European Jewish communities, is anti-Semitism from the left, which comes disguised as anti-Zionism, as a sort of a supposedly legitimate political position. But we're not talking about criticism of the State of Israel, which of course everybody, particularly Israelis, do. But we're talking about demonizing Israel, rejecting its right to exist, comparing it with Nazis, and one doesn't have to be a psychiatrist why Europeans like to compare the Jewish state to Nazis. And also what happens a lot to hold Jews or individual Israeli citizens, civilians, responsible for Israel, something that doesn't happen in any other conflict around the world, and which really becomes again a problem also for Jews living here in Europe that are often confronted with this, bullied, etc. And we just have to take a hard look at the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, that has been taken over by somebody who seems to be equally comfortable with hardcore anti-Zionist as he is comfortable with Holocaust deniers and radical Islamists. And why I believe this is so important is not just obviously, any form of racism, xenophobia, and so forth is a violation of our values and so forth, but anti-Semitism has a peculiar specificity. It often comes along with a sort of conspiracy theory. Your run-of-the-mill racist will hate a certain group, be it Muslims, be it Sinti Roma, whatever, and consider these individuals from this group inferior. The same is true for anti-Semites, but at the same time, while, typical the Untermensch, Jews are considered to be inferior. At the same time, they are considered to somehow secretly control the world. So they are Unter- and Übermenschen at the same time. And so if you have a mindset that really an entire worldview, a warped, confused worldview that informs your whole thinking and basically makes you unfit for modern society and certainly for our Western civilization. And if that really takes root, we will no longer be functioning societies. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that these kind of conspiracy theories and deep-rooted anti-Semitism that has really been fed in the Arab world is part of the problem in the Arab world. If you no longer look at yourself, critically examine your own societies, if you have an easy scapegoat and blame every personal and national misfortune on some conspiracy, then it's difficult to make progress.
And what do you make of the responses to that, especially recent rise in anti-Semitism? Because I suppose there is no doubt about the rejection of anti-Semitism by the mainstream, that's for sure. But dealing with the more conspiratorial mindset is extremely challenging, and I understand the reasons why it concentrates in this anti-Semitic field. You describe the reasons. But, I mean, what are the tools that you can think of for making sizable progress along the way?
First of all, as I said, one of the problems is that two major sources of anti-Semitism are very difficult to discuss for various reasons, and we just need to overcome this. And I mean, the first of all is to identify and clearly articulate the problem before we can even begin to tackle it. And here, I think it is extremely important, first of all, to really also for individual Jewish communities in Europe, to feel the solidarity of the majority community, that one is not alone, that it is, these sentiments are equally rejected, whether they come from neo-Nazis with shaved head and black boots, as well as from within certain elements of the immigrant community or the far left. We just need to all stand up, and we need political leadership, opinion makers, policy makers, to always take a clear stand and make sure what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in polite company. That is for me a first step, and I want to at this stage sort of applaud the Austrian presidency, which is in the process of pushing through the European Council, and it's not easy, a declaration against anti-Semitism, which would also include a definition of anti-Semitism that would include these kind of new forms of anti-Semitism as I described earlier. But it's not easy, and it shows the difficulties we still have to overcome. And second, apart from the political confrontation, obviously when we're dealing with anti-Semitism that has a different quality within some elements of the Muslim community, this is a question of our overall integration policy that just needs to be radically different, not just in order to counter anti-Semitism, but obviously integration has to a large extent failed. Just look at the parallel societies that we have allowed to establish. To give you one policy advice that I could easily submit, I'm not sure it will be easily accepted. If you look at these schools in these problem zones, in these parallel societies, and you have schools with 90–100% of the kids coming from immigrant background or themselves recent immigrants, how are they supposed to integrate into the society if the classroom where they spend their formative years doesn't reflect the society but reflects the parallel society? So we need to take these kids out of these schools where they will not integrate, where we know they will fail no matter how much money we will put into these schools, and we need to distribute them among the general school system, which also would make the burden sharing of integration much fairer within the majority society, because at the moment, we are confronted with a situation where particularly sort of the lower class in Europe, in the poorer neighborhoods, who may not have voted for immigration in the first place for other reasons, nevertheless have to sort of take on the lion's share of trying to integrate people from a different background. And people who have made these decisions are to a large extent insulated from some of the negative consequences of it. And I think it would be much fairer to do it otherwise. And it may also, I think, be a contribution to take the fuel out of the populist parties that are to a large extent driven by anti-immigrant sentiments and by that feeling that, that there is not a fair burden sharing and that they're being imposed a policy that they don't have voted for.